All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked, and it's Friday, and it's Friday the 13th, which I guess for a lot of people, there's superstitions, and that brings about a lot from, okay, so what are you going to do with today and superstitions? What about Christianity? And we've been talking about the Olympics, or we've been talking about actually competition over the last few weeks. So with all this bound up, what does that mean for Christianity? Like, people are superstitious. I was talking to someone and they were going for a position, and we were praying over for the job. And I was saying, hey, what about bringing some other folks in? And his response was, I don't want to jinx anything. I don't want too many people to know. And I remember back in the day when my wife and I, with our first child, like there was talk of, when you talked about when you were pregnant, like don't announce too early because you don't want to jinx it. And I'm wondering too, with today in Friday the 13th, the Olympics are all over. We still have this idea of competition and stuff, but for the Gospels, when it comes to societal things like superstitions, like competition, how does the Christian, in your estimates, because both of you are church leaders, you're community leaders, I have leadership within the church as well as within the academy. And so the question comes to us a number of times: what does it mean to be a Christian in 21st century? We have just what is going on with our culture right now, with a lot of schools wrestling with how do we open safely? What about our churches? What about Sundays worships? Do we have an actual vaccinations section? Do we mask? And so this idea of competing ideologies is real. And then with that, some people are gonna, well, how much do we trust? If I'm vaccinated and I trust that the Lord has given us medicine, and so he's allowed for doctors to come up with ways to be safe, but then other doctors are saying even further safety is a mask. So, but I don't want my superstitions to get in, because sometimes I have to admit that I want to put my faith in the Lord, but I feel like if it's too good, I have to prepare myself to fail or not get it. So how does, in your estimate, both of you, and within the realms that you both are placed in, with the people that you're serving and the mission field that you're around, how is it that we continue to we want to compete? I mean, there is an aspect of competing, bettering myself for the sake of the other, right? I'm compete against myself, self-discipline, that kind of stuff, but I don't want it to overwhelm me. And I don't want it to be to where then I compete with you, Jim, or with you, Phil, on who's the better Christian. Together, I want us to be who we were created to be. But how do we do that in a culture right now where a lot of times it really is win at all cost, and like we were talking last week, second place is usually not heralded as something great in today's culture. And then with our superstitions, a lot of Christians are afraid of, like, oh my gosh, if I'm too positive or too wanting it, that's not going to happen, because even though we talk about a God who's love, a lot of people really push into a God of judgment. I know that's a lot to start with. And hey, folks, joining us Friday, this is a way to start. This is the good way, a nice light introduction into Christianity in the 21st century, right? But this is new wine, right? Why not? This is what life is. Isn't life just this conglomerate of so many things going on at one time, where we have to learn how to navigate? So how do we do it?
Man, so there, gosh, the story I could tell here. There's a lot that you did give there. But last week there, at my job, we allow the guys to go to church and stuff like that. We opened that back up just a couple of weeks ago, and it's been pretty good. Most of the churches are smaller, and they have multiple services and stuff like that. So, been able to kind of still go, and they can distance and stuff like that. Last week, I heard of one of the churches that we're sending the guys to, that it's a pretty large church, and they're doing away with their multiple services for the rest of the summer. So it's going to be like a couple thousand people in the church. And I asked the guy that went, "Did you see anyone wearing a mask, or did you?" And he was like, "Nah, no." And I was like, "Oh, I don't. Ah, man, I feel very uncomfortable about allowing guys to go there for the next little bit, just because I'm nervous that, like where we work, let's see, 80% of the people are vaccinated. And just on the outside chance that someone at the church is unvaccinated, unmasked, breakthrough thing, and then the guy comes back to the harbor and transmits it to any of the guys there, and I got really nervous about that. So I don't really know what to do, man. um, yeah. So I mean, for me personally, man, I've never really stopped wearing a mask. I stopped wearing it at work because they didn't ask us to, and most of the people there are vaccinated. But if I go to a grocery store, or restaurant, or anything like that, I'm always having stuff on. So I don't know if that means I have weak faith, but I just not trying to bring home something to my daughter. That's the whole,
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. Yeah, for me, I think my immune system is strong enough. I've dealt with that kind of stuff, but yeah, my daughter's isn't. So yeah, that's been my caution right now.
You know, yeah, Matt, you brought up a lot of stuff. I mean, my mind, when you said, superstition, I mean, my mind goes kind of in a totally different place, because, and I'm not going to go down that road yet, maybe later, but, like when you say superstition, what prevented, I mean, when I became a follower of Jesus, what I believed, or what I grew up with in the stories in my culture, the Hawaiian culture, those stories were superstitions. I mean, those were looked as superstitions, and my faith was put into question. And so, when you talk about superstitions, it's like, whoa, 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 but I know that's not what you're asking now. Or maybe it is, but I think, just to kind of follow up on what Phil's saying, I think the challenge of the competition is, and being quote good Christians, is that, a lot of the arguments that you hear about masking up and not masking up, it's not a biblical discussion. I mean, it's not a Christian discussion, and so to me, it's like, hey, let's, we got to make a decision. But, when churches start saying, oh yeah, we're talking about freedom in Christ, or, we got to just live by faith. I mean, it's kind of like, to me, when they say stuff like that about living by faith and coming, it's like, hey, let's bring out the poisonous snakes for worship and test everybody's faith. Right. And so I think that, and the idea of competition that you're bringing up, there needs to be space for tension, right? I mean, there needs to be space to know that sometimes there's no absolute answer. And so I think with the COVID thing, there is no absolute answer. There's some people that are like Phil said, family that has immune issues, right? Now the debate, here's the debate. The debate I'm hearing that I'm kind of like centering in on is questioning whether healthcare workers should be tested, right? My mom contracted COVID by a healthcare worker. I mean, her place was shut down in March. She was in a memory care center, shut down in March. It wasn't until June that like 5 healthcare workers tested positive. My mom contracted, the next day they tested my mom, she tested positive, and less than a week later, she passed away. And so, this debate about whether healthcare workers should or should not, you know what? I'll tell you where I stand. But I think that there's space we need to have space for tension. And so I think the church, we just need to be respectful. Last week we talked about, the Bible tells us, take care of the least of these. And so the most vulnerable, that's who we need to keep an eye out on. But I don't think there's any, I think we need to hold tension when it comes to church. And I think when we start to say, well, this is what the Bible says, this is what we should, I think we're stepping into dangerous ground.
Yeah, isn't it interesting too when folks in the church all year round are, especially when it comes to political things, tend to take us a backseat and say, oh, I don't want to really discuss this. And then yet with the COVID stuff, the amount of experts that I come into contact with in the church, about whether or not masking is good medically, or vaccinations are all there, and all these people that I'm like, God, I didn't know that you had a medical background, or I didn't know that you were a sociologist in your testing, And so I wonder when it comes to how people are reacting, even with the mask, like they do this then biblical argument that you're talking about. I'm like, but what is the background that you're coming from? And what about just the biblical precept of love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself? Like, I don't know why that's such a complex issue when it comes to, and maybe because loving the other, so vaccination, okay, fine. You have some medical things there for certain people that they just can't take a vaccination, or that it's more dangerous to them. The masking thing, to me, for the life of me, and I'm not one that is a fan of wearing masks, to be honest with you. I don't like, but when I go into the store, even I don't like, for me, I judge it by, at least I try to, with the workers, like if they're wearing masks and stuff, isn't it most beneficial? I mean, isn't it the most loving thing, or one of the loving things? I guess that's where our language comes into, right? When we start talking about this, if I say, oh, wearing a mask is the most loving thing, well, aren't there other ways for me to be like, not going out would be just as loving, right? Not actually. And then if we're all, so this is the levels that I think where the church gets it problems at, is because we teach people how to read the Bible, but we don't really teach them how to read the Bible, And so when it comes to, what does the Bible say about COVID-19? What's the Bible say about masks? I'm sorry, but it doesn't say anything, specifically about those issues, but it does tell me how I'm supposed to love you, Phil, and I'm supposed to love you, Jim, right? And sometimes, at least in my life, when I'm loving others, a lot of times, if I'm honest with myself, I feel inconvenienced. And I'm talking about people like close to me, my wife and my kids, folks like you who are in my life, and if I'm honest with myself, even the people that I think I would lay my life down, even during the day, sometimes when they ask me things, like, it is an inconvenience, but I'm happy to do it. Where is it that I'm lacking on that want to do it for others who might not be in my, personal orbit? Like, how are we as the church missing that movement from loving the people closest to me to then the next step out and the next step out? Like, where do you think that disconnect is, especially in this culture right here? We're seeing it where our circles are so small of who we're willing to love.
Yeah, that question of who we're willing to love that you ended with, it does become a thing. Like we're willing to love those in our house or in our immediate circle, but the stranger, as long as it doesn't inconvenience me, I'm willing to love. That's kind of how, in some regard, that's how it merges into. Where it's like, as long as the love doesn't inconvenience me, I'm willing to do it. And loving the people that closest to me, those are the people that doesn't inconvenience me. But then everyone else, that becomes the issue. This is where we get a bunch of different arguments coming into the fray, right? Where we just want to say, hey, I'm only willing to love so much. And it's like that's kind of not the example that Jesus laid out for us. When we wear a mask, it's not for, whoa, sorry about that. When we wear a mask, it's not for our benefit per se. It's more so for the benefit of the other person. We're acting as if we're carrying it, so then we're wearing a mask to help protect other people. And it's not even foolproof, but it's a measure that we can take. And so I don't get why that's so much of a challenge. That's the biggest thing. And the I think the worst thing for me is that when I see someone that challenges the idea, I question a lot of things about them because I can't see the perspective. And that becomes the problematic thing, is I can't see the perspective. So I'm like, okay, this is just crazy. You're just being inconvenienced and you're angry about it being inconvenienced. And so I end up upset at the person. It's like, well, you got to have some reasons to it. And then when I hear more reasons, I'm like, no, you don't have any reasons. So I do need some help seeing the perspective. So,
Yeah.
I would say, it's what Phil said. Phil, like you said last week, I think this idea about, the difficulty in loving others. And, sometimes, Matt, you brought up family. Sometimes it's really hard to love your family. I mean, I remember one time, we had a project going on. We had some friends from out of town. And I asked my friend Rob, I said, hey, Rob, maybe you should help me get this done, because I know that if Glenna helps me, I'll be less patient with her, And we kind of just chuckled about it. But, that's the case. I mean, we go somewhere and sometimes we just use up our goodness on others. And then we come home and we just don't have enough for our family. But I think what Phil says, we talked about last week, I think it's loving yourself. I think it's just, I think when we are able to love ourselves and be confident within ourselves, that helps. I mean, I think that helps. But, there's so much anxiety we're carrying right now, right? I mean, this whole mask thing, we're trying to do, should I not? I mean, And so I think we're just kind of caught in this place where we're, the frustration builds up within, and the self, loving ourselves is so hard now because we're just, what does it mean? And just the frustrations that we kind of, lash out. The other piece too, I think, just two pieces. One is loving yourself, and the other piece is just a communal mentality. I mean, when I see what the arguments are, it's about my rights. It's about, and it's Christian nationalism. It's the, blending the Constitution and the Bible into one.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing with that, and it goes to your first point, Jim, thinking of the gospel and believing that I'm lovable becomes a question to this conversation too. Understanding that Jesus loved me and that I'm someone that's lovable is a challenge too, because you and we know ourselves, and we're like, maybe I'm not as lovable as Jesus thinks I am, but that's the fact of the matter, is that you are lovable, and yeah, you can love others. And those who have embraced and responded to the gospel, you've been so overtly loved that you have some to share. so,
Oh.
so that's part of it, right?
Yeah. And maybe loving is so hard. Loving ourselves is so hard. It's just easier to pick on other people so that we feel better about ourselves, right?
Right.
Isn't that why? Don't you think in the 90s, that's why the talk show, Jerry Springer and Donahue and all these, they popped, Maury Povich, they popped up because it was a look into lives that were not as good as ours.
Yeah, at least I'm not that bad.
And I was reading an early Christian mystic, and he was saying how pride is rooted in competition. Because we start to compare. And I just, this is the thing I've been really wrestling with, is I find it fascinating. And maybe I've just missed these dialogues, but the great commandment, to love the Lord your God, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus doesn't ever specifically speak in there about enemies. And yet all throughout his ministry, he's talking about loving your enemy and, being peaceful towards your enemy, and vengeance is not yours. And I'm wondering if sometimes I'm even missing the point that, see, if I learn to love myself, then I don't see any enemies, right? Because I see them as me, in need, in what I needed. And there's an aspect of you that's just like me, that if I become in tune with, if I was really honest with myself of what I needed, then I would see what you needed. And it doesn't break down by gender, doesn't break down by color, it doesn't break down by age. It breaks down by the fact that we're all human, and because we all believe in the origin story of the Christian Bible, that God, Father, Son, and Spirit created everyone, and there's no bad creation. There was never a need for a do-over. And yet there's still God recognizing that the human stepping in, and we can somewhat taint it, go back to Noah and the flood, where God was talking about, our need to understand, like, hello, do you see what's happened when you continue to turn to self? And I'm wondering if we started to be honest with ourselves and saw that the greatest enemy that I have against loving God is myself, because like you were saying, Phil, I don't find that I'm lovable. And if I'm not lovable, then how can I ever love you? Because what the Bible says is the correlation between the way I love you is the way I love myself, So how do you, though, especially in your setting too, Phil, you're coming, the dudes that you're interacting with, I mean, I would imagine that many of them are probably closer to admitting brokenness than maybe those of us who the world has allowed us to have stuff, right? But I'm wondering, though, is there also that still hesitation for a lot of the folks to even acknowledge that, no, I am lovable, regardless of my situation. The world tells me you're a piece of, but the gospel says, no, it doesn't matter. There's no situation that you can ever be in where Jesus looks at you and says, you're not lovable.
Yep. Absolutely. That becomes one of the biggest challenges that we end up sharing, is how valuable they are before God, how valuable they are to society, that they have something to share and to give to the world. That becomes a very serious thing that we talk a lot about, and whether or not they believe it, we share that with them all the time. And another thing connected and related to it is working with those guys. You realize just how not really how similar our lives are. Just degrees different. You know, one or a couple of little changes, and we would be in the exact same boat. That's the thing. That's one of the things you end up realizing the more and more you work with people, is that we're only degrees different from one another. There's a couple of stories, and everyone has their own kind of drama in their lives, but we're all pretty close in our stories and whatnot. So yeah, it's one thing understanding that you're lovable, but understanding that we're not all that different from one another. No matter where we came from, there's still so many similarities, far more similar than we are different. So
Yeah, yeah. You know, the other thing too, along those lines, had an opportunity to go with a congregant of mine to, what was it? Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, and I'm like sitting there thinking, okay, this is what the church should be, because they kind of just start where the pain is. They start from, this is where I am, this is the mess I'm in, this is the healing I need. And it's not like, but I'm not, you know, there's no justification. And if you even try to justify that, it's kind of like, okay, you know what, start back from where you were, instead of trying to justify how good you are, but just really, you know. And so, you know, maybe it's, when it comes to just that self-love, is that we try to skip over those things, but really kind of, instead of you know, like Phil was saying, you know, when we did helping with the meals and stuff, man, you know, you're talking to people that, you know, I'm thinking, wow, that could be me. I mean, this person had a job, and, you know, it was a couple payments, or, you know, a couple mistakes, and the mistakes aren't like mistakes that, oh, I never would have done that, but it's like, holy shnikes, I could have done that. But getting back to kind of the Alcoholics Anonymous, I mean, you start with your pain, you start with your mess, and you work from there. You start to, you know, it's kind of diagnosing, right? This is my struggles, and it's okay to be there. And then you start working towards healing.
I think when we were, gosh, it was November or December, I think, when New Wine did we did the conference on disabilities. And one of the breakout rooms, Dr. Carl Kutz from Multnomah was talking about, he did I believe he did his PhD on Job, in the Hebrew work on there. And one of the things that struck me with that was in his talking about, really he was talking about the essence of that book is presence. You know, that Job was like, he had these questions, you know, and it's right for us to have questions for God, but most importantly, like, Job wanted to be in present. Like, he thought he was going to go to God and say, what about this, this, and this? But then once he got into the presence of the Lord, he realized that's what he was wanting, right? And I find so often with me that in these moments where the Lord wants me to grow more intimate with him, I so often fight that, because it goes against everything that I have been taught in this culture, that in order to get something, I have to work hard and I have to be better than the person next to me. And so I'm always looking to the left and to the right going, okay, well, what are they doing? Because I've been told, you know, even in academics, you know, and even at the seminary, you know, when I was doing my work at Multnomah, like we rated each other, you know, and for our grading, you know, like, and who was the number one in the class, you know, and all this. And yet in those moments, what I found is that when I was willing to stop, and it's this weird process of trying to detach from the worldly accolades, you know, that are all around me, because like even now this month, and there's weird celebrations that you want to sort of be like a fun competition. This month, my wife and I celebrate, you know, 25 years of marriage. I find it interesting where we post all these things on like Instagram and Facebook, and I struggle with it. Wait, am I posting it to go, ha, 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 look at us, woo? I mean, it is a celebration. I think it's amazing that my wife has been okay for 25 years, you know, and we'll joke all, right? And we'll all joke about this and think, I like, how do we celebrate without, like, you know, compete? Like, cause it's still good for me to encourage you, isn't it? Like, I think it's awesome that each one of us has been able to celebrate and enjoy the celebrations of marriage, right? And I think because we all value marriage, right? But I don't want to compete with you and saying, oh, my marriage is better. And so sometimes I feel like this weird tension. And I appreciate you, Jim, saying that we need the tension, because I feel so many times that we retreat. Christians are saying, oh, social media, no, don't post anything. You cannot post anything, because then you're boasting. And I think sometimes there might be, right? There is that tension. But when I am boasting 25 years, I think it's great in today's culture for people to stay married, and in happy marriages that just don't. So often I hear people, oh, they're together, but they're just partners. They're just two ships passing. So there is a celebration of that, and a bit of a boasting. But for my wife and I, the boasting really is in thank you, Jesus, for giving us 25 years of blessed, just in that intimacy with him. So, but I don't find that at the church on Sundays. Too often I feel like the messages from the church is not dealing with the real life stuff. It's like well, just read your Bible and be better. Okay, just be a better person. And so what does that betterness mean for the Christian, at least and I'm not saying this is how all the churches are, obviously, but it's go to church, and make sure you tithe. Okay. And now, just don't talk loudly about your, irritations about whether it's masking or vaccinations, right? You just sort of keep your head down, and that's how you love people. But then behind the scenes, you're talking trash about them, And so I wonder if the messages, though, that are coming out from the church have been so discombobulated over this last year. And so the excuse is COVID has excused us stepping deeper into the truth of loving self, right? Because everyone is so, I'm depressed, I'm isolated. And so we've stopped self-care. We stopped caring for ourselves in the sense of we have so much time at home. Shouldn't our prayer lives be vibrant? Like God's gifted this. Yes, COVID it is a tragedy. Jim, you of all people know how tragic COVID is, right? I have to believe, though, that you, even experiencing death, could still see during this time of this last year, though, the Lord has blessed us with these opportunities. And so it's perspective. How do I see it? Do I always see it as a darkening and a dampening, and this God is a God of wrath and retribution, and he's just a downer? Or even in the midst of this darkness, even in the midst of the pain, I'm able to step into that for some unknown reason other than I can just say it's faith, and still see the beauty in this situation. And that's hard. And if the church isn't teaching us what that means, then how that's the community, right? But how do we get people to see, oh, this is all a part of God's movement? But we don't want to have the cheesy cliche, oh no, it's all going to work out. How do we get people to trust and believe?
As you were sharing, Matt, I was thinking, what's closer to our everyday lives? Was it Jerry Springer or Maury Povich, or the what you just brought up a second ago, the what a Christian should be? Which one's closer to everyday life? And I wonder that, because I think that yeah, we look at many of our lives and think, okay, my life is closer to Jerry Springer, but everyone else is closer to what everything should be. And it's like, well, no, most of our lives are probably a lot closer to Jerry Springer. And knowing that that's part of our story and that's reality. And albeit we can, when we share examples at church, or when we share through preaching, or when we share and talk about our lives at church, yeah, man, we have space to talk about the horrible stuff that's going on in our lives in a place where we can get prayed for and around people that care for us. So let's take advantage of that. I mean, that's one thing. When I was going through Multnomah and I was lab instructing or whatever had me at the front of a classroom, I would make sure to note to all my students, you're not going to get into another spot where everyone else around you is a Christian and they care about you and they want to pray for you. When you leave and graduate and go work a job, most often, and most of y'all are going to be in places where no one really cares about what's going on in your life. They just care about whether or not you're producing on this job. So take advantage of people that can pray for you and pour into your life. You have professors that are willing to have lunch with you and share with you and talk with you about life. So take advantage of that. And so the same thing happens when we go to church. Most of us catch hell 6 days a week and then wander to church for 2 hours on Sunday thinking that's going to revive us to go into the very next 6 days, when not if you don't share, not if you're not open. And that's part of going to those meetings. You talked a minute ago about AA and Celebrate Recovery is another one up the same alley, where same kind of thing. You're there to share, you're there to understand the dark side of your life and to get some help walking through the dark side of your life.
Yeah.
So take advantage of that. You know, that's one thing that we miss sometimes at church. So yeah, at least on Sundays.
Yeah.
What is the I don't understand though, because we talk about competition. Americans understand competition. Okay. I mean, the nations, the world, I think there was only a couple of stories of like, you know, people sharing medals, right? They just don't share medals in the Olympics. So as far as like, you know, competition, we all understand competition. So in that light, while we do understand competition, what happens when it comes to faith, where people are not willing to compete for the faith? I think about Genesis 32, and where, whether you want to say from my theology, it's Jesus wrestling with Jacob, right? But it's an angel of the Lord. He seems to be competing because he says, you know, stop. And then Jacob says, I'm not going to stop until I receive my blessing. That seems to be competition. Paul in the New Testament seems to say, I'm striving to be the greatest of all, right? What is it about faith then, when we get into faith today in the 21st century, where we get a little pushback, whether it's a hard time, it could be even as tragic as a death, where a lot of times for me, if I don't get what I want, or I have something that is darkened, like you're saying, Phil, there's a lot of darkness in today's culture. I have a lot of excuses to just quit the faith. And a lot of times I will, like, I don't walk away from faith, but I do in a daily moment where I'm like, I'm just not going to do, I know what the righteous thing to do is. So with Americans, the tension I find is that we are very competitive, but when it comes to faith, a lot of people lose that competition, that drive. Where do you think that goes? Why, you know, especially to, and I go back to that story that you told, Jim, with your friend who was just so amazed at how easy it seems to be a Christian and to become a Christian in the culture. What is the church playing into the mediocrity within the Christian faith, because we're just not being authentic in the beauty that comes with the supposed sacrifices or surrenders or tragedies? Are we not... we, meaning the preachers and the teachers and the leaders, is the gospel message not being proclaimed in its fullness?
So Matt, when you brought up about Jacob and you brought up about Paul and talking about, you know, their participation in which is perceived as an individual sport, right? Because they're wrestling with, you know, God, and, you know, Paul talks about running the race, but you know what, it's more of a team sport, right? I mean, I think about you were talking about wrestling, you wrestle individually, but it's a team score. I mean, and so, you know, could it be that while we compete, or while we're competing as people of faith, it's a team sport? You know, I mean, because, so for me, you know, what I've experienced with my mom, like, you know, like Phil says, I don't want to be around a bunch of people that, oh yeah, Jim, you know, it's really a bummer. People, you know, these healthcare workers should be vaccinated and all that. You know, I don't want to hear that, right? I mean, I want to hear people say, hey, tell me about your mom's life. You know, what was it about the beauty of your mom? And you know, and there's people that I could, you know, that I want to be around. But then there's also opportunities as a team sport to say, you know what, I lost my mom. When somebody loses a relative, or, you know, like Phil, for you to lose a daughter, to be able to, you know, it's like this individual sport we go through, but you found support within that community. But at some point, it's going to become a team sport when you say, you know what, I know what you're feeling. I know the pain that you're going through. And let me tell you, as painful as it is, because you can tell them what their pain is and they're going to go like, oh man. But then when you say, you know what, Jesus, I mean, you know, and I don't want to just say Jesus to kind of like, you know, sprinkle, but Jesus walked me through the pain and the agony that you're feeling now. And so that's when I think it becomes a team sport, that as individuals, we run the race. You know, I wouldn't want anybody else to lose their mom. But, you know, God put me in that position. I mean, Phil, I know that you wouldn't want anybody to, you know, lose such a beautiful daughter like Genesis, but God has allowed us to compete in this race, or compete in whatever, right? Can we turn that into a team sport? Can we turn that into a win for the kingdom of God?
Absolutely. And I was thinking of the other places, a similar, thinking of Jesus wrestling in the Garden of Gethsemane, not wrestling physically with God, but that wrestle of, Lord, can you take this from me? I mean, that there's something to that, but thinking of Jacob and thinking that his name became the name that the people were known by, that there's some important, there's some really intense or important part of that wrestle, where it becomes on behalf of not just you, but it becomes on behalf of the community. You know that there's more going on here. And so Jesus saying, not my will, but thy will be done, knowing that he's reaching for all of us, for all those who sin would be put upon the cross with him. So there's a lot to that wrestling portion of it. There was one more thing I wanted to say, but I can't remember it right now. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it alone.
The team thing is brilliant, Jim. I mean, I don't even know why I didn't think about that too, because you're right. Wrestling is so individual, but it's so community driven. I mean, the years that when I competed and had like some good years, like the training partners and the guys. So you see on teams where, you know, when I was wrestling, I think we had, when I was doing well, so the 118, 126, 130, like all of us when one of us was doing well, all of us were, you know, because we're all communal wise, right? We're wrestling always together. And that's in the church too. You see that, you're right. Because when you have a group of folks who are pressing into Jesus, it doesn't mean that you don't get up some days and want to curse him for taking your mom, even though, is there a taking, is there a loss? Well, with the believer, there's none of that. We know exactly where they're at. We know, but there still is an absence. And you know, but when you're communally going through that, then the closer I am to you, and I think this is where it's interesting, because, you know, how we have tragedy all around us, especially, you know, in the New Wine community, there's people dealing with significant health issues themselves, or family members, right, that are sick or not in good health. And so, but the communal aspect, so that I think a lot of times we're afraid to, if I know that you suffered a loss, I don't want to say something that where I'm like, oh my gosh, how could I have said something so insensitive? But the more we press into each other, then the more you know that I love you, Jim. Even if I say something that's insensitive, you're not going to take it as what a, you know, because you're going to go, he just wasn't thinking, but I understand because I know he loves me. And so I think a lot of times when we get irritated at people coming to us and stuff, it's because there's not that intimacy, because in the church, we do highly promote the individuality, all the while forgetting though that the individual is not who they are without the community. You know, Jesus in the garden, sweat and blood on our behalf, even though he was doing that in the garden by himself, he wasn't alone. You know, the Spirit, same thing with the temptations, right? The Spirit comforts him. And so it's like stepping into that.
And the result ended up being a team. I mean, it affected the whole team, right? I mean, it was the body of Christ.
Yeah.
You know, and I think maybe it is just the contextualization of what our culture is. The Western culture is more individualistic. And so they look at from that aspect instead of, you know, Jesus. And I mean, he was an indigenous person. They look communally at things. And so, but I think it's just that contextualization of just how do we get outside of that individualistic mentality.
Yeah. And we ended our talk last time. We are all on the same team. What? We have one church, Jesus Christ. That's it. We have one Lord, one Savior. Why? Yeah, it does seem difficult for us to see each other on the same team. And then, yeah, we do go back to our homes and we have our individual things that we wrestle with. And understanding it's okay to wrestle with God over these things. It's okay to argue with God over these things, because we come back to the community and realize that everyone else has wrestled and argued with God too. So it's okay to go down that road. So yeah, that's definitely where a lot of this stuff lands, is understanding that we're on the same team.
Yeah. You know, we look at the competitiveness, but you know what? I mean, like, I love, you know, when Paul talks about being foolish, right? I mean, to me, it's like, you know, I don't mind laughing at myself. In fact, you know, I mean, I love it when people, because, you know, it's like you lower the bar, right? I mean, once you lower the bar, all of a sudden everybody else is given permission to say, okay, you know, I can do that. But I think once, you know, if we're willing to, instead of trying to raise the bar, you know, lower the bar. I think that invites people.
And not like the mentality too that I find that I wrestle against, you know, is I can't allow my love for you to be a reaction as to how I perceive you're loving me,
Yeah.
you know, or lack of loving. And so I'll hear a lot of times, well, but they did this. And I'm like, gosh, man, if I expected Jesus to love me the way that I loved him, you know, and he treated me, he would never be up on the cross for me, you know. And I know that a lot of times when I'm counseling folks or talking to them, it's hard because Jesus seems so otherworldly. You know, he seems so out there because, like, when I start talking, you know, Phil, I think you mentioned it earlier about how, well, when I talk about loving myself, the problem is I know myself. And I'm like, man, some of the things that I do and think, you know, and so what do? I tend to project it onto you because I think, well, this is how I am. Of course, you know, Phil's not saying anything. This is probably what he's thinking. You know, he's looking, you know, the last time we got together, he was looking at me differently. And so I think he's probably, you know, judging me, right? You know, or Jim said these nice stuff, and so I project onto you what I'm really wrestling with. And until I have that honest conversation with myself, what is it that causes so many Americans, and I'm speaking just Americans because this is the context, to not want to have those intimate times with just them and Jesus? Why do so many in the church neglect that part?
There's a couple answers here. One, we're always busy. Slowing down to have time with Jesus, and that's not a productive part of my day. When it's probably the most productive part of your day. But I think in part, yeah, we're so accustomed to having our lives jam packed with stuff that's slowing down and saying, okay, I mean, there's apps where you have a 5 minute devotional, and all the person on the devotional is telling you to do is breathe and sit down. And it's like, I should be able to figure that out on my own, but I need an app to tell me to do it. But we need an app to tell us to do it, because if we don't do that in the app, we're not ever going to do it. So we should be able to take moments to be with Jesus. And many of us do. And we find probably the ones who do, we end up knowing that they do before they tell us that they do, because there's love coming off of them. There's wisdom coming off of them. And we're around them like, yeah, you do something different than me when you open the word. So yeah, those folks we got to tap into.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, in addition to that, again, it's the Western culture is productivity, right? I mean, you got to work at it. And so what is kingdom of God? What is kingdom of heaven productivity? What does that look like?
Yeah.
And maybe
and that's
you know, sometimes it's just a calm spirit, you know, but it takes too long for that. And there's too many things going through our heads. We just don't know how to capture those things and not allow them to get our attention.
Yeah, I mean, could you imagine if, and I talk to Metzger about this all the time, if, you know, if ever I'm starting to put in a position to create a program for seminarians and pastors, one of the first, you know, I'm going to have a class on listening where they do nothing but learn how to listen to each other, right? But then also a class where you're graded on sitting still. Because most of the folks that are going for advanced degrees and leaders of the church, they tend to be whatever, like whatever you want to call them, type A, you know, the alpha, whatever the case might be, right? Leadership. And yet some of the worst things that they don't have, you know, I mean, that they've learned is that you got to just be going. And so when you talk to these pastors and leaders, that the sign of weakness is an empty calendar. You know, a day where you have you don't have back-to-back stuff. And how can you ever spend time with Jesus if you're going, so this is the productivity, and this is what the continued push that we're going to talk about, like next week and the week after. And how is it that, fine, we will produce, because Jesus talks about production, right? He talks about, but what is it that we're producing? What fruits are we producing? And so next week, we want to continue to talk about this. It's not that either one of us, any one of us is saying, oh my gosh, if you're doing stuff, then that's evil. Absolutely not, because Jesus talks about the production of fruit and what our lives will look like. But what does that mean when it talks about kingdom, like Jim was talking about, this kingdom perspective, and how does that line up with then living in the world so that we are in but not of? And so we want to continue this dialogue. For those of you that are joining us, happy Friday the 13th. Hey, I'm not really one about marking, things on our bodies, for permanency, but there's probably some crazy tattoo deals on Friday the 13th if you really want. Okay. So you could probably even get a $13 tattoo. These are the things that we do to mark. The most important though, Mark, that each one of us, me and Phil and Jim, want is that mark of Christ. And that mark of Christ is love. And it's learning to love yourself so as to love me. And when I love the Lord my God and I learn to love myself, then I'm a greater lover of Phil and a greater lover of Jim and all of us together, right? So we want to continue this dialogue, that mark of Christ and what that looked like in the 21st century. And so on behalf of Phil, on behalf of Jim, I'm Matt. This has been New Wine UnCorked. If you haven't subscribed, go right down below there and hit subscribe, and then hit that little bell so that next Friday at 10 a.m. when we come back on, you'll be notified that, hey, New Wine UnCorked's coming live. Or go on over to our Facebook page right now and hit like there. And so you'll be informed anything that New Wine's doing through our Facebook or through our YouTube, or go to our website, new-wineskins.org. That way you can join things that are going on. And if you're not in Portland, you're not in Washington, you're not in California, there's ways to bring new wine to the local areas, because we want that engagement through a Christ-centered Trinitarian approach. It's individual, but it's also relational, just like each one of us. So again, on behalf of Phil and Jim, I'm Matt. We'll see you on the flip side. Till next time, have a good one.